Workbenches and storage are two of the most important things in any workshop. I recently spent a ton of time and money building this workbench, only to realize one thing. I need another workbench. But not just any workbench, one that turns into 3 workbenches, which will hopefully solve my shop's biggest issue. The problem is, due to my schedule, I only have 24 hours to make it, and in the scramble to get it done, I overlooked one major design flaw. And I can't believe I overlooked this. I don't know if I have the time to actually fix this. And like all my shop furniture, it can't just be functional, it's got to look good too. There's one thing that a bunch of us have in common: not enough storage. Whether you have a dedicated workshop, a one-car garage, or a basement, we all face problems when it comes to storing our tools, materials, or simply just our stuff. Storage is a necessity in all our lives, but one could argue that workshop storage is a different beast altogether, as our storage needs aren't just to store things in a dedicated space, but that space also needs to be usable in order to build whatever it is that we build. For example, a miter saw station takes up a lot of space. So what do we all do? We put storage underneath it, like drawers, cupboards, or places to store offcuts. The workbench I'm trying to build in this video has a very specific storage solution for my workshop, while also being a usable area that's going to allow me to easily continue creating unusual future projects. But when is enough enough? Let me show you my current setup. Now, this is my Rubo workbench, and it's primarily used for hand tool work. And this is my assembly table that's used for glue ups and just general assembly of my projects. But the more my business grows, the more areas that I need to be able to build my pieces. So I would love another giant work surface for general work, not to mention some extra storage. But I also need an area that's going to solve one of the biggest issues that I'm having with a specific tool of mine. And that specific tool is my vacuum press. Now, it's not the pump itself that's the issue. It's the bags that's the issue. Now, these bags take up quite a bit of space, but realistically, this is the easy one. This bag is the difficult one. Because of its massive size, it's almost impossible to have it permanently set up without taking up valuable workshop space. Now, you may be thinking, well, it's easy enough just to set them up every time you want to use them, and you're right, but it does have a few issues involved with this. When I want to use this big bag, it now takes up my entire assembly table, so I can no longer assemble things. So here's what I need to design. I basically need another workbench, as well as a place for more storage, but also a permanent area to be able to house this large bag, as well as the small bag, as well as the pump. And that's all going to get done in this area here, which up until this point has basically been a nothing area in my workshop. So I need to turn this relatively small area into a space that's going to house 3 massive workbenches and solve all of the issues that I'm currently facing. And hopefully we'll get to the bottom of that in this video. Oh, and I only have 24 hours to build this. Yeah. I don't know why I do this to myself. I have so much shit to do, not to mention that client build. Now, Workshop Nick did a terrible job of explaining what a vacuum press is, but basically it allows you to clamp veneers to a substrate with incredible clamping pressure within a sealed bag. Not to mention the fact that you can create some pretty wild looking curves like this. Now, that big blue box is my pump by Vacuum Press, who were kind enough to provide me this unit for a discounted price. One of its key features is the auto cycling mode, meaning that once the pressure gets to the correct vacuum level, the pump will turn off, and once the level drops below a certain point, it will turn back on. This is very important if you want to be pressing things for a long period of time, as you can run the risk of your motor burning out before your glue sets. You won't see it in action in this video, but my next video is really going to push the limits of this technique, but more on that later. What you've been watching me cut up are the components for the first workbench, which I'm assembling using a torsion box technique, which is quite common. Basically, it's a grid pattern that gets sandwiched between a top and bottom layer, making a very strong tabletop, which is important because that tabletop is 2.6 by 1.4 meters. Now, I thought I'd make it in separate rows for a number of reasons. One, it makes it easier to assemble in smaller sections, and two, because doubling up the long rails will make it stronger. But there is a design flaw in this top, which you'll see shortly, but in the meantime, let's see if you can guess what it is. One of the most frustrating things with shop storage and shop maintenance is time. How often do you have big ideas to help improve the productivity of your shop, but find that you never have the time to get around to it? One thing that I've been doing for the past few years is that while I'm building client jobs and come across a solution to any production or performance issue, or just general shop improvements, I'll write it down. Then I'll set aside 1 week of the year to try and knock all these things out. And that time is now, except I spent the majority of the week doing other shop improvements. But if you're on Patreon, you would have seen all of them take place, like this, and this. Which didn't leave me much time to complete this workbench, which is why I only have 3 8-hour days to make it. And I don't have a choice in this. At the end of that 3 days, this project needs to stop, whether it's completed or not, as I need to get back to client work. And if I don't get it done, I have no idea when I'll be able to get back to it. And this rush is going to show because I made some poor design choices that will come back to bite me. Understandably, this project is a little different to what I normally do here on YouTube, but I have to admit it's a bit of a nice break from the usual overcomplicated things I make. It was this type of work that I was initially trained in, as I am a qualified cabinet maker, so the first few years of my career I built cabinets of all types using manufactured boards like MDF, particle board and plywood. Granted, I am rushing through this process, so I'm not necessarily following all the best practices, but once again, this is shop furniture and I do have a tight deadline. But I do find this type of work less mentally draining compared to the usual builds I do, and this break couldn't have come at a better time because my next video is going to be my most difficult piece I've ever made. I've been planning this one for years, and if you liked this curved bench, then you will love what's coming next because it follows in the same style. So be sure to subscribe if you want to see that video. The only problem is, it's so difficult that it's going to take a few months to make it, which unfortunately means no YouTube videos until it's finished. But if you are interested, I'll be documenting the entire process while I'm building it over on Patreon. In fact, I've already started showing behind the scenes updates of this piece. I'll also be showing short technical tips of the build, not to mention I'll be releasing one long form video per month, which gives you a real insight into some of the processes around my techniques. Now, I know I don't post all that much here on YouTube, and that's because good things take time. Not just the builds themselves, but also the video production, which is all 100% done by me. But it's thanks to these incredible people on Patreon that not only support what I do, but also enjoy the other videos that I post, which are in a different style where I talk directly to the camera about things that I've learned as a woodworker and business owner. The relaxed nature of these videos allow me to post regularly, so if you are interested, I'll leave a bunch of links below to extra content, including an extended 5-part series of this build, as well as a review of my Altendorf panel saw, which is fitting because this was by far the most used machine on this project. Now, I just mentioned that I do 100% of the video production, which is one of the most common questions I get asked. Who makes my videos and how many employees do I have? And the answer to that is I am the only person that works here at Padula Studio. I design and build all the furniture. I also take all the photos and film and edit all the videos, which seems like a lot, and it is, but I genuinely enjoy every part. And I guess that shows the kind of world we live in today. The fact that we can access information to all different skill sets is incredible. I guess the only limitations we have is how much time and energy we want to put into something. But working by yourself does have some downsides. For example, imagine building a workbench on top of your old workbench, then realizing that you can't get the new workbench off your old workbench because there's no one around to help. My old boss's advice of work smarter, not harder, is ringing in my ears right now. So I'm now at the end of day one, and this is the progress so far. To be honest, I'm not super happy about that. I did expect to get more done, but unfortunately I had a few distractions throughout the day, which is pretty standard when you run a business by yourself. So this means that tomorrow I need to get the next 2 workbenches done, which isn't going to be easy, so wish me luck. Okay, so it is the next day. I've come in first thing in the morning, about to start the next workbenches, and noticed that this workbench that I built yesterday is starting to dip a little bit in the middle. Because I'm building this for myself, I can experiment a little bit, meaning I can make a little bit of a thinner top than I probably should have. But right now, I do not have the time to be focusing on this. I need to get onto the next 2 workbenches. Now, there's a number of reasons as to why this didn't work. One is the thickness of the top. Clearly it's 70 millimeters thick over a 2.6 meter span. This isn't enough to support it. So I should have made the grid material thicker, as well as a thicker top and bottom layer. But I do have specific height requirements I'm trying to achieve in this design. So a thicker top would mean a taller bench. I've also made the grid pattern quite large in order to fit my brad nailer and drill. These are all choices I made in order to get the project done quickly. But this is not something that I usually condone. But to be fair, I'm not that fussed about a dead flat top for this bench. It's the second and third benches that I want as flat as possible because this is where I'll be vacuum pressing veneers. And if these tables are cupped or warped, then I run the risk of introducing that cup or warp into whatever it is that I'm pressing. Now you're currently seeing me make the second bench, and thanks to the different design to this bench, I'm able to add in a support rail to the underside as well as a drawer cabinet that will help to structurally support the top. It also helps that my floor in this area of the shop is level, which to be honest surprised me because this is the only section of my shop that's actually level. Now I've just realized that we're well into the video and I haven't even spoken about the material, which goes to show just how excited I am about this stuff. This is MDF, possibly my least favorite material. I do try to avoid using this stuff as much as possible, but it certainly does have a time and place, and it's a perfect material for this project as it's flat and more importantly, it's cheap. Now we are making good time today. The second bench is done and now I'm onto the third, which is a little more complex than the first 2, as this is the bench that's going to hold the pump as well as the small bag. And because of its smaller size, I can get away with having a flat top without the effort of making a torsion box, which will save time. It also helps to have a very expensive panel saw like this one. Now, I've got to admit it feels good to finally use some real wood in this project. It's actually inspired me to use more of it later on, but these strips of wood act as a spacer to ensure the workbenches all align properly. Hopefully this scene starts making sense of how these benches work, but if not, here's the SketchUp file, showing how it's all going to come together. Now, I guess you could just leave it here, but the front of those benches look a little boring. So tomorrow I'm going to add some false draw fronts to make this piece look like a proper piece of furniture, which is going to be a little tricky, but that's tomorrow's problem. For now, it's time to go home. So I have a 4mm flat top blade on my panel saw, and I've raised it just over half the thickness of the material. This will make sense in a second, but basically what I'm doing is cutting the shape of the false draw fronts into the MDF panel. Then, because the blade is set a little over halfway, I can simply turn the board over with the same fence setting and cut off the false fronts that will get attached to the second bench while still keeping the lines for the remaining false fronts. Once again, that'll make sense shortly. I'll then be able to use this same method to cut out the actual draw fronts. Yes, unfortunately, there are some real draw fronts in all this fakery. As mentioned before, one of the biggest problems in our shops is storage and organisation. Now, granted, I do have a large shop, but it seems the bigger your shop, the more stuff you buy. So I find myself with similar storage issues that I had when I worked out of my parents' 2-car garage. But I have found that coming up with creative solutions to me specifically is quite enjoyable. When I actually have the time to do it, that is. I mean, at all other times, it's just flat out frustrating. But the point behind this bench is to solve a number of issues, all within the same footprint. Now, understandably, not everyone needs a 2.6 by 1.4 metre workbench, but this same concept can work in all different sizes and applications. For example, you could design the top bench as an assembly table or outfeed table. The second bench could be used as a custom track saw table or MFT table, or even a hidden router table. And the third could be a low-lying workbench for building tall cabinets, or even use it as an offcut bin. Or you could redesign it as 2 tables instead of 3, utilising the top one as a CNC table and the bottom one as a table for your laser cutter. This 3-in-1 design opens up a world of options, which is why I've made the SketchUp file available on my Patreon, which means you can reference this file and come up with your own to your specific requirements. I'll leave a link to it below, but just learn from my mistake and make the top of the first bench thicker if you're going to have a wide span like mine. And this is something that I'm going to finally try and fix next. Now it's time to fix the dip in the first bench. I'll do the obvious solution, and that's to add a stabilizing board to the back of the bench. This will help to flatten the top at the back side as well as stabilize the legs. Now the other obvious option to help straighten the front of this bench top is to use some steel angle, but I don't have the time to drive out to my supplier at the moment, so I'm going to use wood in somewhat of an experimental solution. I'm going to put the wood under tension in order to counteract the dip in the bench top. This wood is Tasmanian oak. The straight grain in this Tassie oak is important for this idea to work as intended. Another important part of this process is these temporary MDF strips that will allow the wood to rest on while I begin clamping. That clamping block sits under the bench top, which allows the bottom of the clamp to grab onto, while the top of the clamp sits on the wood. By clamping the wood down and the bench top up, I'm bending the wood grain, which naturally wants to move back into position, in turn counteracting the dip in the MDF bench top. I've overextended the bench top slightly, so instead of being flat, it's more like a frown. But the natural weight of the top will bring it back down to mostly flat. Once again, I'm not too concerned if this bench top isn't dead flat. It's the other two that matter more. Now, like I said, this is an experiment, but this is also shop furniture and a perfect time to test out some unusual techniques. Let's face it, we all make mistakes, and that's totally okay. But personally, I feel like it's not okay for me to make mistakes on client builds. They pay a lot of money for a high-end piece, so I have to be on my game when it comes to these pieces. But the reason why I can be so confident in approaching a client build is because I've experimented and failed countless times on my own pieces. Whether it be an experimental piece for my home or on my shop furniture, where it doesn't necessarily matter if the quality isn't up to scratch. It's mistakes like this one that's allowed me to understand my limits and get better as a woodworker, designer, and business owner. So we'll see if this solution holds up over time, but for now it's working quite well. I mentioned earlier that one of the biggest issues with setting up my vacuum bags is the fact that it takes up my assembly table, meaning that I can't assemble things whenever I'm vacuum pressing. The other issue with that temporary setup is the plattens. Now, plattens are panels that sit inside the bags and they have grooves cut in them to allow for airflow, which provides for even clamping pressure. They're big and heavy and are difficult to place into the bags, and you can run the risk of tearing or creasing the vinyl each time you set them up. I've decided to make some new plattens as my old ones have seen better days. I'm using white melamine MDF in 25mm for this, and the reason why I'm not using raw MDF like the rest of the project is because I want that smooth coating as glue won't stick to it, which is very useful when pressing veneer in a vacuum bag. Although you can wax the raw MDF if you want to. I'm basically cutting a 3 to 4mm deep groove with my panel saw with even spacing in between each. So my race against the clock has clearly defeated me. Normally when I'm facing a big time constraint, I don't have an issue with staying back to get the job done. In fact, 8-hour workdays aren't a common thing for me. It's usually more like 10 to 12-hour days, but for whatever reason, there's been a ton going on lately. Lots of events and social gatherings, which is great, but it does put me under some stress sometimes, as there's just not enough hours in the day to get things done. And even though I've been trying to make more time for outside of work, this build is so close to getting done that I'm just going to have to cancel my plans tonight and push to get it finished. A few more hours will let me get this thing in working order. Plus, I may now have the time to do something not totally necessary, but still kind of cool. Now that I have a bit of extra time, it seems only fitting to have my nameplate on this workbench, like I did on my Rubo bench. But instead of using my friend's CNC like last time, I'm going to use my Xtool P2 laser cutter. Now, I'll admit I'm fairly new to this machine, and usually I'm a bit impatient when it comes to setting up these things, but the dual HD camera lets me see the material inside the laser bed, which means I can place a file wherever I want, so I don't have to mess around with zeroing things in. A big thank you to Xtool for sending me this laser cutter. They did provide the machine and a number of accessories, including this air filter, so I'll be using it in a bunch of creative ways in my videos coming up. If you're familiar with my work, you know that I make a lot of unusual templates, so I'm excited to see how this laser cutter can help me take those templates to a new level. I'll leave a link below if you want to know more about this machine. Now, before I continue with this nameplate, there's one thing I keep seeing online that I just have to try. I'll admit I feel guilty for having to cancel my plans tonight. Understandably, these things happen, and probably something a lot of business owners can relate to. Time just gets away from us, and what doesn't get finished today is only waiting for us tomorrow. Thankfully, it's not as common as it used to be, but it's still a tough thing to deal with, because a lot of the time, I feel like I'm not getting enough work done, but also feel like I'm not spending enough time with friends and family. But these days I have a much better work-life balance, as I've learnt that a good personal life means a good work life, and a good work life means a good personal life. And the reality is, sometimes things are just going to be crazy at work, and sometimes they'll be quiet. We just need to take it as it comes. Now, understandably, this isn't my best work. I've certainly made some choices that aren't up to my usual standards. I haven't filled any of the pinholes or covered any of the screw heads. Plus, I would have liked to have painted the insides of the benches, but realistically, those things don't matter for this piece. The most important thing is that it works. But for now, I can be happy that my workshop has another issue solved in a way that's only going to help create better and better pieces in the smoothest way possible. Not to mention, look at all that extra storage.